Good morning or afternoon, everyone, depending on where you're located. Thank you for joining today's session on top tips for adopting and scaling service virtualization. My name is Jamie Motherall, and I'm one of Parasoft's functional product marketing managers here. And on the line with us, we have my colleague Ruben, who is one of our functional product solution engineers. Ruben, did you want to say hello?
Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, and thanks for joining today's session.
We're really excited about today's session. We're going to be going over some of our top tips for adopting and scaling service virtualization today, and really how you can streamline your adoptions, accelerate the scaling, and get benefits faster when it comes down to embracing service virtualization across your application teams. Now, before we dive in, we do have a little bit of housekeeping. So, if you do have any issues where the slides or the demo are showing up to be a little bit blurry, please be sure that you go into full screen mode. That will make the resolution much better for your viewing purposes. If you could also put any questions that you have into the question section, we'll be addressing them at the end of today's presentation. If you do have any technical issues, please be sure to also make a note of that in the question section, and one of our colleagues on the line will be reaching out to try to assist you. Anyway, let's dive right on in. All right, we've got a quick agenda to keep us organized today. We're going to start off by answering at a high level what is service virtualization and review a simple use case of how it works and the benefits it brings to organizations and adopters. From there, we will start breaking down our tips on how to adopt and scale service virtualization across teams. We do have a short demo portion planned for you today where we will be going over environment management, debuting our new capability in Parasoft Virtualize, which is learning mode, and we'll discuss how it will help teams more easily adopt and scale. And then we'll show a quick overview of how to easily and automatically switch from testing against live endpoints to simulated services. From there, we'll do a quick recap and then dive into any questions you have from today's presentation. Now, again, please keep in mind we've allocated that time to go over those questions. So, at any point, if you do have a question pop up, make sure you put it into the question section, and we'll be sure to review it at the very end. All right, well, let's dive right in. So, we're going to start with what is service virtualization. Now, we often hear people refer to service virtualization as a mock or even mocking on steroids. And there is some truth to that last one. So, let's break down the differences. At the core, the primary differences between mocking and service virtualization is the level at which objects or dependencies are being simulated. Mocking is primarily used in unit testing to isolate the code under test in the same way that a QA tester, for instance, would want to isolate their application under test to enable end to end testing, which often leads to the confusion between the two terms. Service virtualization, however, is operating at a higher level and more robust in capabilities in comparison to mocking. Mocking typically is focused on the lower code level and simulates individual functions, methods, or components within a software application. It's focused on isolating and testing specific units of code without considering the overall interactions with external services or internal services. Service virtualization, on the other hand, emulates the entire service, APIs, or even an entire system. So it's much more robust and it's designed to replicate the behavior of external services as a whole, enabling the testing of the interactions between the tested component and the simulated service. So now that we've clarified the difference between mocking and service virtualization, let's dive a bit deeper into the benefits of service virtualization itself and how it works. So, a good way to start talking about service virtualization is to review a common use case, removing environmental roadblocks to integration or end to end testing. So let's start with our happy QA testers. They've been tasked with creating and running integration tests against their application under test to prepare for a coming release. Now, this team is under a bit of pressure as they've had little time to test. And not only do they have to create new tests to cover new stories and requirements, but they need to run their regression suite to ensure that the new version of their application has not broken existing functionality. Their application has a web UI in this scenario, and their end to end test will first start with the user interface. Under the hood of the web UI, their application is constructed of APIs that are like puzzle pieces. They're connecting in different ways, communicating by passing data between API services. And their application has a browser based API or an experience API under the hood. So their browser actions are directly interacting with an API that is then passing the request query to another API that then communicates to a third party external service API. Now, this this third party service could be controlled by another application team or by a partner company. And as long as the external service remains live and all the APIs in this workflow remain stable, the testing team should get the expected result when they run their test cases. However, what happens when a test case goes down? Or what happens when an end service goes down? In this scenario, there's many reasons that that external service could suddenly become unavailable for testing purposes. For instance, the API could experience some changes to the API schema. It could be controlled by a parallel development team, and that API could still be under development, so not live yet. Or the API could simply be unstable for a variety of different reasons, which we'll break down later in today's discussion. Either way, the result is the same. The data coming back to the QA team is showing that the test fails, and the testers do not get the expected result and now must allocate time to analyze the test to determine the root cause of failure. In this case, this isn't an issue or a defect within their application under test, but the problem lies in the test environment. The QA team now has wasted valuable time to determine the cause of the failure and is blocked from running their end to end or integration regression tests because of this external API they need to test against not being available. And this is where service virtualization really kicks in. By creating a virtual simulation of that endpoint, then you're able to test against in the virtual service versus the live service. In this way, they're able to remove testing roadblocks by simulating the dependencies and can take control of their test environment. And they're able to get the correct data to come back and have a full workflow that is successful, enabling them to test their application even when their endpoints are going down. Now that we have a high level understanding of how service virtualization unblocks testing teams and removes those pesky environmental roadblocks, let's take a moment to discuss the way in which service virtualization can benefit your organization. These key areas are one way that you can justify the introduction and adoption of service virtualization to your executive suite. At the core, most organizations decide to adopt new technology due to the four primary business drivers: reducing costs, increasing speed, increasing the quality of the software, or reducing risk. Each of the concepts we're about to review are tied to these specific drivers, and often these drivers are interconnected. When it comes to presenting service virtualization to your executive team, focusing on these primary business drivers can help your message and presentation to resonate. So let's start breaking down what these benefits really are. First one, reducing cost and capital and operating costs. Service virtualization can reduce hardware costs by simulating dependent costly hardware systems or components for testing purposes. This mitigates the need to provision or replicate physical hardware or infrastructure in the development integration environments and helps you to reduce your capital and operating costs. In addition to this, many third party services or components also come with licensing costs. So, by virtualizing those components for development and testing purposes, organizations can also eliminate licensing costs. Minimize or eliminate testing downtimes. Testing often requires access to the actual service or systems. During testing, these services or systems are often allocated for testing, which results in scheduled downtimes, which impacts your business operations. When you're simulating these services and these systems, testing against the simulations, you can mitigate the potential revenue loss or cost resulting from operational disruptions. Increase productivity and efficiencies. Service virtualization enables an acceleration in testing velocity by putting environment control in the hands of the test engineer. Often, testing teams need to share testing environments, which can result in slowdowns due to simultaneous usage of dependent systems in testing scenarios. This impacts your velocity as it hampers the ability for teams to work in parallel with each other. By simulating these dependencies, each team can test against their own version of a simulated service, enabling them to accelerate development and testing cycles and work more efficiently in parallel and enabling them to speed up their time to market. Provisioning or accelerating the provisioning of applications, environments, and resources. Simulated services can be easily shared and simultaneously used by multiple development and testing teams, enabling organizations to mitigate slowdowns in test velocity due to the time it takes to provision and allocate resources. By simulating the dependent systems and creating virtual test environments, programs can reduce those operational costs and reduce the time it takes to allocate resources. Reduce time to market. We've already touched on this a little. As you can guess, a lot of these are interconnected, but service virtualization really has incredible benefits to streamline your time to market. It enables workflows such as parallel development and testing streams, continuous testing, shift left or early testing, reduces the testing bottlenecks, increases your test coverage, it provides consistent and reliable test environments for automated testing, and it can stabilize your regression test executions. And then finally, at the end of the day, the whole goal is to produce high quality software. Service virtualization enables teams to have more control over their test environment, enabling a shift left mentality and giving testing teams the ability to start testing earlier and more often to a higher degree of test thoroughness. This reduction in testing downtimes enables them to increase their use case coverage and reduce risks when it comes down to releases. The more time you have to test and the more stable of a test automation process you have, the more positive impacts will have on the quality of your resulting software. So let's start breaking down our tips for adopting service virtualization. Aligning with organization's goals. Does your organization have a specific initiative you can attach the challenge that you're trying to solve to? Are they trying to, for instance, reduce costs, adopt agile practices, or shift left and start testing earlier? Oftentimes, if you can identify the roadblocks to these larger initiatives and focus on the way that your proposed solution, and in this case, it's service virtualization, if you can focus on how that can address the challenge, you can help to secure management support for adopting a new technology. When you're first getting started, it's really important to identify the primary key and critical dependencies. Selecting high visibility projects or widely shared dependencies, or targeting a particular project with dependency challenges to be the first to target for service virtualization, can help you to secure a wider buy in from management and other application teams. The key is to collect the metrics before and after implementation to prove the effectiveness and positivity productivity gains for adopting service virtualization. Determine the who's and hows. By this we mean determine who will be creating the virtual services, how will they be leveraged, and by who. There are a number of different implementation modes, and we'll go through some of these in a little bit during our presentation. Collaborate and share across teams. Scaling service virtualization requires evangelizing and proving to multiple application teams the benefits that can be gained from investing time into learning service virtualization and the implementation and adoption. When you collaborate with other teams, the return on the investment for service virtualization increases and benefits can be shared by all. And then finally, select the right tool to support your needs. Not all tools are the same when it comes down to service virtualization. We'll quickly go over some of our top tips to keep in mind when you're analyzing tool capabilities, things that you really should look out for. So let's get a little bit more granular here. Now, I recently was at the Star West conference in Anaheim, California. And we had invited a couple of our customers to join for the conference to speak on a panel discussion about the benefits of service virtualization. It was a fantastic time. It was so fun getting to know the customers a little bit more and understanding and hearing their stories about how service virtualization had impacted and benefited their application teams. At the end of the panel discussion, someone in the crowd asked a great question. The person had been looking at service virtualization for some time and they understood personally the benefits it could bring to their team, but they asked our customer for tips on how to get management to approve investing in a service virtualization solution. Now, as I already mentioned, aligning to your organization's goals by tying service virtualization to that larger corporate initiative is a key way to achieve management support. So, here are some of the key initiatives that have motivated service virtualization adoption in my experience of working with our customers. Agile workflows. Service virtualization empowers agile workflows through the promotion of concurrent development and testing. It diminishes that reliance on external dependencies and permits early and recurrent testing and complements the fundamental tenets of agile methodologies, including continuous integration, adaptability, and risk mitigation. It enables continuous testing by allowing software development and testing teams to overcome dependencies from external services or systems during the testing process. This is particularly important in today's software development landscape, where many applications rely on complex networks of interconnected services and APIs. When testers are able to isolate their application under test, they can successfully adopt continuous testing workflows knowing that should a dependency go down, their automation will still automatically run and switch from testing against a live service to a simulated service. Many organizations also look to adopt initiatives to shift left, embracing the methodology that aims to move testing and validation activities earlier into the software development lifecycle. This helps to identify and resolve issues earlier, reduce costs, and improves the overall quality of the software. Service virtualization supports shift left in the following ways: it enables concurrent testing amongst teams, reduces test wait times, improves collaboration, which provides faster feedback to development, reduces the cost through shifting the identification and remediation of defects to earlier in the development cycle, and in that way, reduces the risk of late stage defects. Service virtualization also enables more effective and efficient performance testing by isolating components, eliminating external dependencies, simulating realistic scenarios, reducing costs, and allowing testing to happen earlier in the development lifecycle. It provides comprehensive testing scenarios and offers repeatability and control over test conditions. This helps organizations to identify and address performance issues earlier and deliver high quality software that's reliable to their end users. Across all of these methodologies, we see service virtualization also providing the reductions in overall operational and infrastructure expenses. And this helps application teams to increase their test velocity, reduces project timelines, and eliminates the need for testing teams to have access to real and very expensive environments, services, and components for testing purposes. Now, often what may be motivating you to push for the adoption of service virtualization is the experience of a specific problem or challenge that is negatively impacting you. I want to circle back real quickly to the Star West conference and the question posed by our panel's audience member. Our customer from Cox Automotive did a fantastic job in her response. She said something along the lines of, at the end of the day, it's not about the problem that you have, but rather about making the problem the company's problem through the quantification of the problem. Now, while we all think that we need to quantify the problem in a monetary way, there are other invisible costs that are associated to the challenge or problem you're experiencing. In her situation, she monitored support cases and was able to correlate support cases to the challenge that she had and present to management the number of support cases that could be solved with the adoption of service virtualization. While this was not monetary, the collection of this data was an invisible cost and impacted the brand name because it was impacting the customer experience. This helped her to secure the management support that she needed in order to justify adopting service virtualization. Now, when it comes to presenting and justifying the adoption or scaling of new tools or solutions to your executive team, it's important to look beyond just the visible costs and also highlight the less visible costs when you're presenting to management. For instance, what is the impact to the brand? What is the problem or the challenge resulting in a loss of sales or a loss of customer retention? Is it resulting in increased support cases? What is the cost of support's time to investigate the support cases? All of these are less visible impacts to the company, but still very important. And by gathering this data and including it in your justification process to management, you can much more easily win their support. Now, let's take a moment to talk about what happens once you've gotten the approvals that you need in order to invest in a service virtualization solution. How do you get started? It's important to be strategic about the very first project or dependencies you target for implementation. And there's many different use cases for service virtualization. Sometimes the dependencies are going to be still in development. They're controlled by maybe another application team, a sister program, and they're in the early stages of API development. But you have to wait to test until that endpoint or that component is available to test against, making it so that your team is slowing down in their test velocity. Controlled by a third party or partner. When the component under test or the component that you're testing against is controlled by a third party or partner, oftentimes you don't always have access to it. The third party, if it's an API, well, it could also experience changes and you may not be notified of that, so you can't update it in your test environment. So all of this can cause a lot of slowdowns when it comes down to your test velocity. It could be unavailable for testing. Maybe it's unstable. Maybe it's a situation where you have to schedule time in order to test against it. Difficult to provision or configure in the test environment. It could be that this takes a long time for you to have the resources allocated for you that you need in order to test, needed for simultaneous access from different teams. If you're doing parallel development teams or parallel testing, sometimes you're stepping on each other's toes when it comes down to your testing processes. This is another situation where you may need to schedule time to test against a specific component or within your environment. So, this is another area where service virtualization can come in to help you increase your velocity and your collaboration amongst teams. It can be restricted or costly to use for performance testing as well. Performance testing tends to be very costly when it comes down to the infrastructure needed to support it. So, if you're able to virtualize a lot of that infrastructure, you're able to reduce your costs and also kind of clear the way and remove roadblocks for you to be able to test when and where you need to test. Now, let's talk about determining the who's and the hows. So, who will be creating the virtual service and how will that virtual service be leveraged? Determining exactly how it will be leveraged and who will be creating it is very key to determining your adoption, implementation, and scaling path to achieve success. For example, developers often use service virtualization solutions as a mean to supercharge their mocking and stubbing practices to more easily achieve the isolation of their development environment, which can be critical for the velocity of the development and code level functional testing activities. In this scenario, the developers use Parasoft's free virtual edition to create virtual services. They're trying to take their code that is under test and surrounded by environment dependencies and isolate it for testing purposes. Now, with this, they can actually get away with using Parasoft's free edition of Virtualize. This is great for local development teams or small application teams, QA teams as well. But eventually, you're going to want to scale up. So, as your teams increase as far as the number of users and more development teams start to adopt service virtualization and create those virtual assets, they're going to want to invest in a central server for central deployments. This also allows them to then orchestrate their test cases against virtual assets in a CI pipeline. And this is when they're going to want to invest in that full virtualized solution. Now, let's switch gears and go back to our happy QA team and talk about integration testing again. Often, the QA team may be primarily focused on end to end testing through the application's UI. In this scenario, the QA team does not understand what is happening under the hood of their application and how the APIs are communicating. All they see as they try to run their automated test cases are they're getting an unexpected result of a failed test. Now they need to stop their testing to communicate the issue to development to determine that root cause of failure. In this scenario, it's an external service that they need to test against that has gone down, which is a perfect use case for service virtualization. However, the creation of a simulated service, although it can be accomplished without any coding, it does take domain level knowledge that the QA team may not have. So they call their development team and they request a virtual service to be created in order to unblock their testing practices. However, this is also disrupting the development team. They might have a backlog of virtual services that they need to create to support other application teams. So, in the meantime, the QA team is not able to achieve the velocity that they need in order to test. And this is where Parasoft's newest capability, virtualized learning mode, comes in. Virtualized learning mode was created to solve the following challenges. The learning curve for creating virtual simulations for complex systems can be very challenging, and it often takes a ramp up time for end users to learn the ins and outs of the tool. Those that have the knowledge often have low bandwidth to teach others or create multiple virtual services to enable every application team. This results in a slowdown as far as the adoption, and it stalls out the realization of ROI. Once services have been simulated, they also still need to be maintained as dependencies are also subject to change. When they're not maintained, it leads to technical debt and a slowdown in the use of service virtualization. So, this is how virtualized learning mode comes in. Virtualized learning mode is all about helping you to automatically create virtual services. It helps application teams to rapidly and automatically create virtual services through the continuous capture of runtime traffic through the deployment of proxies between the application under test and the live endpoint targeted for simulation. Virtualize learns real service data to generate and train virtual copies of a real service. Then, when running your test cases in automation, Virtualize will enable you to automatically switch from testing against the live endpoint to a virtualized endpoint in the case of failures. To recap the solution, it's continuously capturing the runtime traffic, using that to automatically generate new virtual services for the QA team to use. Automatically will also update any tests or any virtual services impacted by change, helping you to more automatically maintain your virtual services. And then it'll automatically help you to switch from live to virtual endpoints. The main goal of this is preventing system downtimes and enabling your QA team. Now, that workflow is fantastic when you're first starting out, but over time, your quality assurance team should also start to learn the tool because the learning mode will be great for a lot of use cases, but not every use case. In some situations, you're going to have a very complex system that you want to virtualize, and that's where you're going to want to use the desktop editions of Parasoft Virtualize. This is where you have your QA team creating virtual assets. They have a dedicated QA server, which they're using to implement their automation to stage their virtual assets. This is typically what you see in a small project implementation. But as you start to scale up and you have multiple QA teams starting to adopt service virtualization and create virtual assets, you might want to also get them individual or dedicated team sandbox servers for housing and storing their virtual assets, as well as invest in a golden server. Now, the golden server is a concept that allows you to more collaborate amongst your team members. Um, Clean virtual assets can be hosted on the golden server, and the individual QA teams can clone and copy virtual services from the golden server into their individual sandbox server for testing purposes. This allows them to have control over individual dependent components and be able to more easily customize the virtual service to enable the type of testing that they need to have done. Now, from there, everything is managed through our CTP, continuous testing environment management process, which allows you to easily integrate into a CI/CD pipeline and orchestrate your test cases against specific environment profiles or test automatically against virtual services when a live service goes down. And this is really what it looks like when it comes down to scaled or multiple team implementations. Now, at the core, it's really important to collaborate and share amongst teams. Sharing virtual services with other team members is done through version control. And by sharing, you're able to accelerate the adoption and scale the benefits across teams. Because at the end of the day, problem dependencies are usually not a problem for one team. And when you're collaborating amongst other team members and you're sharing those virtual services amongst team members, you're able to more easily maximize the benefits and streamline the adoption and scaling of service virtualization, which allows you to accelerate the return on your investment. This also leads to better resource optimization. If at the end you have each of your application teams siloed in how they're creating their virtual services, well, you might be stepping on each other's toes or you might be replicating work that one team has already done. By sharing virtual assets or discussing amongst multiple application teams what are those key and critical dependencies to virtualize, you're able to much more quickly scale up and maximize or realize your ROI for investing in service virtualization. It's also important to note that once you've gotten started with your implementation of service virtualization, you need to monitor and analyze the usage. Understanding how often your test cases are hitting a virtual service versus the live endpoint can help you to quantify the problem that you've solved to your management and present that information back to them to justify further adoption and scaling. Finally, it's important to select the right tool to support your needs. And this really relates back to the challenges and barriers of adopting service virtualization. So, what are those barriers? Well, lack of domain or technical knowledge is a big barrier to successfully implementing service virtualization in QA teams. Those that have the knowledge tend to be in high demand, which then slows the adoption and the realization of benefits. Initial invest in the initial creation of service virtualization or of virtual services can be challenging. So training can also be slow as far as the slow process when you're juggling and competing with day-to-day priorities. So creating that first virtual service can be, you want to make sure that there's going to be a solution to help you to do that in a very rapid and easy way. Maintaining your virtual services is really important too. So, you want to make sure that you have a solution in house that is going to be providing you with ways to automatically and easily maintain that virtual service. And then finally, cultural change. Not many people truly understand the benefits of service virtualization. When I was at the Star West conference having discussions with our customers, one of the things that one of them mentioned to me was that there's so many different use cases for service virtualization. Really, we've just scratched the surface with our discussion today and what we've reviewed. Um, the biggest barrier for people adopting it is they tend to just focus on a single use case, a common use case, instead of looking at everything that service virtualization can offer them and getting creative with what they can virtualize. It's all about evangelizing in order to motivate that cultural change of understanding the benefits of service virtualization and how you can leverage it to increase your test velocity. So, our recommendations are look for tools that are low code or no code. So, less technical testers can easily utilize them. Look for tools that automate the creation of virtual service generation. Look for tools that also automate the maintenance steps, and that can help you to automatically switch from live services testing against a live endpoint to a virtual endpoint. And then evangelize. When you get a little bit of success, make sure that you are publicizing that. Make sure that you are conveying that success to management and conveying that success to other application teams. And again, always look for ways that you can collaborate with other application teams in order to maximize the benefits of virtualizing a dependency. Now, at this point, I'm going to turn it on over to Ruben, and we're going to go through our demonstration for you. This is very quick. It's only going to be about 10 minutes of us going through Environment Manager, the creation with learning mode, and the fallback workflow. Please keep in mind to go to full screen to get the best experience. Go ahead, Ruben.
Yeah, thank you, Jamie. So let me share my screen. There we go. So as Jamie was mentioning, my demonstration here is first mainly focused on pairs of CTP, which is the thin client on top of the virtualized server. And one of the capabilities within CTP is that we can draw an overview of the system components. So here we see the components that are like involved in one particular environment, maybe one particular test scenario even. And here we can basically control this environment. So what we can do is, for example, we have a connection here from our backend services called retail to a third-party service called, in this case, the loan processor. And from here, from this web client, we can basically control the whole environment and select which simulation is active. Or maybe if we want to connect to a live system, we can enable the connection to a live system, and the connection will basically be reconfigured in order that the system which we are testing here, this particular system, is then connected to that particular live system. And this can be used in different ways, right? Jamie was talking about the creation process of simulations. So you can create simulations from scratch, and you can make them quite advanced. And then you have to do maybe some manual work, or you want to create it based on out of a recording. A little bit depending on what is needed, you can create like multiple simulations. I have one with an artificial delay, for example, which is used to support in loaded performance testing. I have one which is data driven, and this one is actually activated right now. So let me show you the result of this particular simulation. So we are testing here a system called Parabank. And here I have access to that particular application. Basically, if I do this particular action, then backend traffic will be initialized. Basically, we are calling that third party, and then Parabank receives a message back from the third party, and that information is then displayed here on the screen. Now, what we can do with Parasoft CTP is that we can then control this simulation, not only which simulation is active, but we can also take control over the test data. So here we see that in real life. So without having to log into the virtualized desktop itself, and without having to do more complex work, we can just use this web UI to control the test data of this particular simulation right away. So for example, I can just change some test data here. Let me put in some my name, for example. And if I do another request here, so then I have to request a little bit more, then you will see that in this case it's 500 or less. It's so I actually have to change this test data, of course. So let me do it quickly over here as well. So let me put in my name with a small typo, and what we then will see is if I do the request again, that this test data is like used immediately. There is no need to go into the desktop, change the simulation, but you have the control over all the data which is used by the simulation directly. which is very convenient for people that are just like using the simulations to execute a particular test scenario, for example. Now, one thing which was added in the last release, and Jamie was also talking about that, is the new learning mode. So those simulations that we have here can be generated. We can already do that for years. You can make recordings between two systems. Then you can take the traffic that was recorded, and then within the desktop we have all kinds of functionalities that can help you to support you in building a simulation for that particular recording. What is new here in this last release is that we added a learning mode where we can actually learn on the go, on the fly. You don't have to process the data manually, but it will just like continuously learn from the interaction of the data between the system and the simulation. So for that, let me switch to the virtualized desktop. I have it right here. So this is the virtualized desktop. And for people that are like joining and already working with Parasoft software, this might look familiar. We have the proxy settings over here. These proxies are the components that are like in between. Those are the components that are that control the way the traffic is routed between the environment. And I have an example here. So this is an example where I receive messages coming from Parabank. And basically, this is the part where I'm listening. So I'm receiving traffic from the UI, and I'm forwarding that traffic to the real backend of Parabank. So what we can do here is that we can say, well, for this connection, let's enable the learning mode. So learn the responses. We enable the learning mode for all the connections that we have defined over here. So now what basically happens is that all traffic going to the backend system will be captured by this message proxy. And during that process, the simulation will be generated automatically. So let me take my example again. We have Parabank sitting over here. So let me log in and exercise this application a little bit. You see like account overview, some accounts. So let me click in some account data, basically to trigger the recording of this of those files. Now, what basically happens on the background is that all that data is stored on the file system. So we have our request response pairs sitting here in the file system. We are connected to the real backend service, but while the application is exercised, all that data is recorded and stored on our file system. So the next step could be that if the real environment gets unavailable right now, then what will happen is, and that we can also see over here, there is a fallback connection defined over here. So we are connected to the real service, but we are also connected to the simulation, to this particular simulation that we are generating right here. And here you can see that we have defined that if the connection fails, so if the connection to the real interface fails, that we will use the secondary connection instead to forward the traffic to our simulation, the simulation which was just created during this process. The simulation is actually sitting over here. It was just generated. So for the people that were taking notice, then you can see that the simulation it just appeared here while we were using that application. So let's now go back to Parasoft. I will to Parabank. I will now disable the real backend here in the real backend of Parabank. And what we will see happening here is that if I log in, then I can actually exercise the application in the same way. So these calls will still work, But to prove that we are now talking with the simulation, if I now go, for example, to this particular account, we will see that we get an error returned. And that's because this piece, this interaction, was not in the recording. I only had the recording enabled for a minute or so there was not much data captured, and this particular interaction was not captured in our recording. So that's the reason why we see this error currently. Um, we can also see here in the monitoring. So this is the simulation that was generated. That was done actually completely automatically. So the endpoint was created, and this simulation is actually looking at that folder where all the data sits. And in our monitoring, we can actually see that this is the error that I just triggered, that the data is not there. That was the last call. And here we can also see that I was clicking on those account numbers, for example, this one, and then we got some data back. And this was all generated by the simulation, which was generated runtime while the learning mode was active. Now, an important thing to mention here is that this new learning mode can also be controlled through REST APIs. So if you want to automate the whole process, then Virtualize gives you the tools to do that. In the REST API on top of the Virtualized server, you have control also to create those message proxies, but also to control if the learning mode is enabled or disabled. And of course, if we now enable the backend again, so I will on my second screen enable the backend here for Parabank, then you will see that right away this call is now working again. So now we are back on the backend system, on the real live service, and we are recording again. So the simulation is now learning also this data, and that's being added now to the simulation. So because we are running out of time, I would conclude my demonstration here. Hopefully, I provided you some insight in our new learning mode, and that you have a little bit of a feeling on how we can work with simulations.
Thank you, Ruben. So keep in mind, if you do want to request a full end-to-end technical demonstration of Parasoft Virtualize, we do have a area where you can do that under the assets in Bright Talk for listed for this presentation. All right, we've got a quick recap for you, and then we'll go into Q&A. So, just to recap, service virtualization has real benefits related to the four primary business drivers: speed, quality, risk, and cost. Tying service virtualization to wider corporate initiatives can help you to secure management support. And justifying the introduction and adoption of service virtualization often requires you to consider both the monetary cost of the challenge you're trying to solve, as well as the less visible costs. It's important to think about your adoption and scaling plans early on so that you can gather the metrics you need to justify your further expansion. And then, really sharing and collaborating amongst different application teams on the creation and the use of virtual services is very key to help with scaling. And then finally, at the end of the day, it's all about evangelizing. It's all about showing the results as far as increases in your productivity and test velocity to other application teams and to management in order to scale that support. So we're going to take a few minutes here for the Q&A, but before we dive in, I do want to just point out we've got right there the QR code for our free edition of Virtualize. So if anyone wants to immediately download it, you want to get started and playing around and creating, deploying, and managing simulated services, you can get started right there. We've also included the QR code for the Forrester Wave from the 2022 report. That was the last one that they did on continuous automation testing platforms. Parasoft is always considered a leader when it comes down to most of the analysts in the industry. So I urge you to take a little read through if you're interested in how we actually kind of come up against the competition. And let's dive into some questions. We've got some good ones actually in the chat. One of them, can an AI generative tool like Microsoft's Copilot assist in developing service virtualization assets? Um, Now, as far as for that, Parasoft is highly exploring how we can integrate with generative AI tools. For instance, we just did our release for our API testing solution, SOA Test, and we have now integrated SOA Test with OpenAI and Azure OpenAI models to enable you to more easily create a lot of API test scenarios and to maximize your use case coverage. We've also started to integrate AI, generative AI, I should say, into our Java testing solutions. So on the static analysis side, as well as on the unit test generation side. So this is very close and front to mind for us. At this point, we haven't done anything to integrate generative AI into service virtualization, but it is definitely something that we are continuing to explore as how generative AI can continue to benefit our customers and testers in general. There's another good question here that's on who's building and maintaining virtual assets. At the end of the day, it all depends on what your use cases are. If you're planning on working with primarily your development team to start, if you are looking to start with QA teams, it really depends on what those workflows are because it really depends on what your use case is and what challenge you're looking to solve. Um, Oftentimes, one thing I will say that has been very successful for a lot of programs is to implement what we call a center of excellence team. That center of excellence team is able to then go to each of the application teams and kind of be the solution experts for service virtualization. So they train other people on how to use the tools, they can help in creating very complex virtual assets for ones that are dependencies that are shared across multiple application teams. But at the end of the day, developers often like to have control themselves. So they like to use the virtualized desktops to create their own virtual assets. For QA, the learning mode is a fantastic way to get them started as well. And then also allowing them to slowly build up their knowledge of how to use service virtualization, but in the meantime, realize those benefits faster. And then let's keep going down the list. Let's see. What are the skill sets you recommend for someone looking to become an expert in service virtualization? Ruben, did you want to take that one? Oh, you
Of
might be
course,
on mute.
I had to unmute myself. The skill set. Of course, you have to have some knowledge about like message structures and how systems are working together and how systems are connected. There are no special skills required. Right. The whole purpose of having an SV tool, which is as friendly to use as possible, is to enable you to create those simulations quick and easy, without having to code, without having to have any knowledge about coding. But obviously, it helps to have some knowledge about message payloads, and how systems are communicating in general.
Mhm. Very good. All right. We've already gone over a little bit on our time. So I think we'll end the questions there. I do want to remind people that we do have a lot of assets under the attachment sections in Bright Talk. If you're interested in learning more about how some of our customers are using service virtualization today, we do have a case study in there by Cox Automotive, another one from Woodman Life. And then we do also have our ROI calculator for service virtualization, as well as where you can go to request a full end to end technical demo. Thank you, everybody, so much for your time today. We really appreciate it. It's been a pleasure. And again, if you do have any follow up questions, feel free to reach on out to us. We're always happy to have discussions about test automation, best practices, and understanding what your challenges are so that we can help to solve them. Have a great day, everybody. And again, thank you for your time.
Bye bye, everyone.